All right, welcome back to Psych. This is chapter 13, video number 2. And we're going to talk now about, within our talk about classroom management, discussion of some consequences. How do we know when to establish consequences? When is enough enough? When do we have to step in and change behaviors with consequences? Now, in chapter 7 in this semester, we talked about punishment and reward systems and things like that. So, of course, we're going to integrate some of that in this atmosphere of classroom management. But when consequences have to be established, one of the first things we want to make sure we're doing is helping students understand the natural and the logical consequences of their behaviors, because this is a life lesson, understanding how my actions affect other people. And so when we do so, we're supporting the social and the emotional development of children. And so helping, a couple things to help along those lines is separating the deed from the doer, separate the crime from the person, and treating them as an individual, and helping them reflect upon what they've done. How does that affect other people? Emphasizing their own ability to make right choices next time. And so building up the person is a very important aspect of education, especially Christian education, and dealing with people as Christians, as the Lord would have us to do so. And so we want to make sure we always ask questions rather than making accusations. That's a great principle of life. Ask questions. Don't point fingers and make accusations. And so there's several categories that we can use, if you will, for punishments and for consequences. We could send someone to the principal's office. We could take away privileges. We could have them write about the problem and take a written reflection on it. There's old-fashioned things like detention. There's demerits. There's all sorts of different categories in which we can use consequences. The first one I have here is expressing disappointment. You know, the look on your face or the expression to especially a small child that you're disappointed is a huge factor in their discipline. You may not have to take it any further than that. Just them knowing that they have disappointed the adult in their life can be a big influence in their life. So there's many ways in which consequences can, of course, be administered in the classroom. Some of them are simple, and some of them have to be a little more firm. There's kind of a continuum there of how to advance through that. So when we use consequences, if I can involve the students as much as possible, I'll do so, because they have some buy-in, and that will help them and encourage them to abide by the rules better. That also helps establish some trust. So sometimes some teachers at the beginning of the year will have students give them a list of rules they think are necessary for the class. And of course, you'll get all sorts of different responses on this. And, you know, junior high kids will have a lot of fun with it. They'll goof off, and before you know it, they think, oh, we don't need any rules. But really, when you get down to it, even children understand there has to be some rules and structure. But that can be a great way to get the ball rolling on establishing, especially classroom principles. And then older students, remember, fewer rules may be necessary. They have a little more understanding of what it takes to get along, for a group to get along, be able to learn. And so helping them understand how to manage themselves by asking them and having their contribution, their input, if you will, for having consequences. A couple of warnings here that are some good guidelines for us to remember. We want to always remember that we don't ever want to use our grade book or the grading system as a system of behavior for monitoring behavior, if you will. This leads to grade inflation or grade deflation. I talk about it in terms of purity. Keep your assessment pure. Let your assessment measure what it was intended to measure, which is academic learning. Don't bring in behaviors to it. Don't bring in the discipline system into your grading system. Those two things should be kept separate. If possible, delay your response. If that's possible, it's not always possible, but when you are more calm, when you can be more objective, it can wait till after class. Let it wait. Don't disrupt the entire class for it. Delay if you can. Penalties should be given privately. Serious things should be handled quietly and privately if possible, especially if you have to give a discipline. Work to restore that relationship with a child. Let them know that you love them, that you're their friend. You have to go out of your way after class or in the hallway or the rest of the day to show them that you want to be kind to them, and you have to go out of your way to say hi to them and let them know that you are a person, you love them, you care for them. So that takes some extra work. We want to make sure that we have a scale of penalties. I don't start with my most firm consequence to begin with. No, I have a ladder, a continuum of techniques. I start small, and then if I have to go to the next rung, I can, and then on from there. But I try not to get to that top rung until I really, really have to. Then a couple of things we could teach children, of course, teaching them strategies for monitoring their own behavior, and helping them understand how you can get things done even without that behavior. You can do it in a different way. So always taking opportunities to teach. So when it comes to learning spaces in our classroom, what's the best way to set up desks and chairs, and where should the teacher desk be, and all these different issues of planning a classroom space. And there's many, many different aspects of setting up a classroom or learning space. But here's a couple things to keep in mind as you set up your classroom. There are certain arrangements of desks and seats that work better for different activities. One here is horizontal rows work better for presentations or for working in pairs, whereas a cluster of desks will work better for group tasks and for sharing things. So just keep that in mind as you set up your classrooms. And it is good to have some variety, of course, to move the desks occasionally. But keep in mind that the setup of your classroom will have a lot to do with how students interact and whether they can see you as you give a presentation. That's a seating issue. If you're planning to have people working in small groups, you need to take that into account when you set up your desks. And so some good guidelines for the learning space in your classroom is to be well organized, have things stored neatly so that you can develop a routine in the class where you can say, okay, you have 10 minutes to go play with some of the learning tools or toys in the classroom, and they're put away neatly and they're there again next time you need to have them. Avoid open spaces and racetracks. I like that word there. Avoid places where kids can get in trouble or can develop a place to wrestle or to race. You want to avoid things like that. And then if you can provide choices and flexibility in your classroom setup, it's always a good way to manage your classroom just in the way you set up. So maintaining a good learning environment has to do with posting routines around the classroom if you need to, if you can, encouraging neatness, doing things like even just having due dates and sticking to your due dates, and having some penalties, some reasonable penalties if due dates are not met. And again, handling those outside of your grading system if you can. And constant reminders. Leaders are repeaters, and teachers have to constantly be reminding and communicating and going over procedures and reminding of due dates and things like that. But we as teachers want to give really good, frequent feedback. And that would be a goal of yours as an educator, to give quick, good, quality feedback so that students can learn more from you as the teacher. And that's why you're there, is to give them that feedback so they can monitor their learning. And so those things make for a good learning environment. A couple of the terms here, I mentioned with itness a few minutes ago. Overlapping, the idea of planning to have several different activities going on at once. I admire elementary teachers, especially early elementary teachers, who can have students in one area reading maybe quietly, and then students in another area working on a math paper, and the other area the teacher's with that group, they're reading to her. All that overlapping takes a lot of planning, and I love that type of independent work, but it's hard to pull off. So you got to plan well to do that kind of thing. Moving management, the objective for a teacher to keep moving through the day, transitioning well from one subject to the next, and not being caught off guard. There's a cliche that goes around in education that says no surprises. A good teacher is never surprised. They have a plan, they've mapped it out, they plan for good transitions. Doesn't mean they aren't flexible and that they can't roll with the punches. It just means they have planned like crazy. And then preventing, we want to do all that we can to prevent bad behavior before it even has a chance to happen. And our planning helps prevent problems from even coming up, so our day can be smooth and learning can take place. Remember, the ultimate goal is to make time for more learning to take place. And so the more classroom management skill you develop, the more learning your students can get in under your teaching. And so we can build, create, and foster. Here's a couple things that we can do to develop good relationships with our students. We of course want to build a classroom community where people are caring about each other, where they feel like a small family throughout the day. And we can do that by demonstrating fairness, by being interested in their personal lives, asking them questions that have nothing to do with school, but showing that you care about them as a person. Create connections. Again, being personable with them, doing things with them at lunch, sitting down with them at the lunch table, or playing a game with them at recess, or even visiting them outside of school hours. one of the blessings of being connected to a Christian school that is part of a church is that you get to have connections with those students at church as well on the weekends. And so there's many opportunities to have relationships, but sometimes you have to create those opportunities. But that will pay dividends for you in the classroom the more you work on creating good relationships with their students. And then fostering connections. The last one here is I have seek their input, but don't take it too personally. We do end of class surveys at Maranatha and other places. Of course, we want to know what the students think, but we always have to read those with very thick skin because, you ask people what their opinion is and they're going to tell you. And sometimes that can be a little bit harsh to hear, but you have to have, you can't get your feelings hurt. You take the good and the bad together and you kind of average those two things out and you go forward, you make plans and changes and you do the best that you can. But dealing with discipline is a needed task, unfortunately, sometimes as a teacher. This is what causes some teachers to burn out, is that they didn't anticipate and think about how much they were going to have to be a babysitter, if you will, or break up fights or just establish rules. But there are some good techniques for dealing with discipline. One is that I always recommend is that you don't get outside of the school's policies. If your school has a policy about homework, if it has a policy about late work or lateness to class, chances are your school does, stick to that school policy. Don't develop your own rules and routines in your classroom. Do as much as you can to stick underneath that umbrella of protection, that authority structure that God's put in your life as a teacher and for the students. We can often de-escalate problems before they become big problems. Do all we can to avoid sarcasm and criticism, and sometimes those things add fuel to the fire. And so we want to be cautious about making things worse than they have to, making mountains out of molehills, if you will. We want to de-escalate problems as much as we can. Be careful about telling people why they did what they did. Well, you just did that because you're trying to disrupt my class and you're out to get me. No, most of the time when children misbehave, they're not attacking you as a person. This isn't about you. It's about them and their walk with the Lord. It's about their progressive sanctification. It's about them maturing. It's not necessarily about the teacher. So don't make it personal, and stay professional. And then most students want to comply. They want to please the adults in their lives. And so give them an opportunity to do so. Assume the best of them, as 1 Corinthians 13 tells us, assume the very best and you're likely to get it. And so as we kind of wrap up here, a few what we call least disruptive strategies for classroom management, for stopping things quickly. Eye contact, physical presence, moving closer to someone who's misbehaving can be a very effective tool. Asking questions or giving verbal cues. Scotty, are you with us over there? Can you answer the question on page 31 that we're looking at? Instead of calling him out for talking to his friend. Verbally getting them back on track without embarrassing or without even having to assess or give a consequence or a punishment. You can ask them to think about how their behavior is affecting the class or the school. You can talk to them about how to, let's retrain on this procedure. That's not how we're supposed to do it here. What's the right way? Let's get back to what we're supposed to be doing. And again, we're constantly teaching and training. You can always just ask the student to stop. Say, hey, Michael, you talking back there is not going to work. Please stop. And 9 times out of 10, you'll get the change you need, and you can go right on going. I could also embarrass, or I could point out, or I can make a big deal out of it. That's likely to backfire on the teacher and cause even more of an issue than was there before. So keeping some of those strategies in mind will be wise for any teacher. And then the last one there is offering a choice. Hey, do you want to sit up and do right, or do you want to leave? Do you want to learn today, or do you want to go home? And a child might say, oh, I want to just go home. Well, when it comes down to it, they really don't. And so breaking it down to what the choice is, and again, probably always wise to do so privately, will many times get the change in behavior that you seek. When we talk about high school students, there can be some special problems. Students not turning in homework. One tip here is to establish the consequence and stick to it. And we want to keep accurate records of that kind of thing. It's important that you document these warnings, if you will, or this activity, this behavior in your student information system, whatever that is. Documentation is very important, especially in today's day and age of education. Documenting interactions and problems is very, very important. But we want to think about students who are perhaps behaving inappropriately or irresponsibly. You might think about getting them away from other students that are causing them to want to show off or that are being a bad influence on them. We can talk to them about self-regulation. Hey, this is just not socially acceptable. This is not going to work. You need to think about your behavior and activity long-term. This is not going to be good for you. Having that kind of a conversation with them can be wise as well. I put on here, don't play yes, no ping pong. Don't get into a public showdown or a public fight in front of the other students between you and this student. You want to avoid that, because before you know it, you will have all the students on the side of that student and all of them against you. And that is not what you want as a teacher. And so handling things professionally and privately is always better than causing embarrassment or getting into a tug of war over authority in front of your classroom. Just not something that you want to get involved in. Okay, and let's finish up here talking about good communication. There are good and bad ways to communicate, and communication is a huge aspect of being a good teacher. And if you are a good communicator, then you'll be sending good messages to your students. I want to point out one thing here. I won't take time to talk about all this green one here. Students respond to what they think was meant, not necessarily the actual words of the teacher's message. Perception becomes reality. And that's very important in education, that you are perceived rightly. Students will go home and talk to their parents and their family about you. And they will elaborate. They will always make themselves look better, and they will always make you look bad. And that perception becomes reality. Whether it's true or not doesn't matter. And so we always make sure that we are being very aware of how we're being perceived. And taking that into consideration every day as you communicate is a huge aspect of teaching that will have big consequences. And so thinking about some of the ways we communicate, working to understand the emotion behind someone's words, what they're trying to communicate, even though they may be emotional and upset. And that we talk about that. The previous slide talked about that here as paraphrasing rule, about listening to someone and then putting it into your own words or asking them to do the same for you. Kind of helps diffuse some of that situation. And remember that our nonverbal communications are key. The way you sit when you're listening to someone, the way you listen to them, the way that you, if you cross your arms when they're talking to you, that body language is a big deal, especially dealing with children. And it will have a big impact on your ability to develop trust between you and the people that you're serving. And then the last thing here is iMessages, just helping students understand how this is affecting me as a teacher. Hey, Jennifer, when you're doing that in class, I really feel like you're not paying attention, and that is causing me some extra anxiety as your teacher because I'm trying to get everybody to learn. I'd appreciate if you would not pass notes during class. That kind of iMessaging goes a long way to help just kind of deal with the raw emotion in the situation and helping students understand how it's affecting you as the teacher. And you can also ask them to do that for themselves. How is this affecting you? They can give you an I statement. Assertive discipline is the idea of developing a method for discipline that's not hostile. One way that people do assertive discipline is they will put a person's, like if a student is misbehaving, instead of calling the student out or singling them out and saying, hey, knock it off, they'll turn around on the board and write their name on the board. And that sends a message to the student that they are under the radar. They're under the watch of the teacher. Teacher didn't say anything. If the behavior continues, the teacher might put a check mark next to the name. And there's a pre-established protocol or system for what that means to the student. That might mean they miss out on recess. That means maybe they get a note home, etc. So that's a pre-established type of policy or procedure, but that's assertive discipline. Instead of taking it personally and lashing out, have a system in place whereby you can regulate behavior by being confidently stating what you expect and ignoring the promises to change and teaching self-management, but doing so in a non-threatening, non-hostile kind of way. And so remember that passive and hostile responses typically do not get the response that we think they will. Using frustration or anger does not result in the the outcome that we really want, that we're trying to get, and dealing with their classrooms wisely and maturely, and doing so purposefully and with pre-planning will be a big aspect of who you become as a teacher and what you're able to accomplish in the lives of your students as you try to ultimately help them learn the most that they can.